Hello, Jack Middleton, the Empowered Vegan here, and welcome back to the Empowered Vegan YouTube channel. This video is the second video in a series of 3 where I talk to Gage Corlett from Sharp Knife Shop in Hamilton. And we're going over all the tips, tricks, and skills that you need to know about buying and owning a high quality knife. In the first video, we actually talked about how you go about that process. What are the factors that you need to know when considering purchasing a new blade? And in this video, we're gonna actually get into the nitty-gritty of how to properly sharpen your knives on a sharpening stone. So stay tuned, this is an awesome interview and I know that you're going to love it. So Gage, last week you'd mentioned that there are 2 main types of steel that you're going to encounter when you're looking at Japanese knives. Now, does the type of steel make a difference in the sharpening process?
Yeah, so absolutely. When sharpening a stainless steel, we're going to use a more obtuse angle to sharpen the knife. This is going to give us the best balance between a sharp feeling knife and one that's going to hold its edge for a decent amount of time. When we're sharpening carbon steel, we're going to sharpen at a more acute angle or flatter to the stone. The reason we can sharpen flatter to the stone with carbon steel is because of its hardness and its durability. It's going to be able to maintain that more acute angle without dulling super fast. We could absolutely sharpen a stainless steel knife as flat to the stone as we would a carbon steel knife. It would get relatively sharp. The only downside to doing that is that the stainless steel knife, being softer steel, less durable, is not going to be able to hold that edge for very long. In fact, you to the point where you could make a few cuts and your knife could be dull within a few hours of using it. When we're sharpening a knife, generally speaking, we want to move through a progression of around 3 stones. That's an ideal situation. You can still achieve relatively good results with 1 stone. And I do carry a combination stone that has 2 grits on it that you can achieve really great results with as well. But again, ideally speaking, we have 3 stones to work with. A coarse stone, which is going to range anywhere from 50 grit all the way up to, let's say, 600 grit. A medium grit stone, which is going to range anywhere from 800 up to 2000. And a fine grit stone, which is going to range anywhere from 3000 upwards of 60,000. The coarse grit stone is going to remove quite a bit of material from our knife. It's going to help with any sort of minor repairs, chipping, broken tips that we may encounter on our knives, and is going to put a new edge on our knife. After that coarse grit stone, our knife is still going to feel a little bit toothy. It's going to have almost a serrated feeling edge to it, and it's not going to feel amazingly sharp after that stone. That's why we start to refine our edge using those 2 next stones in our progression. The medium grit stone is going to act as a sort of bridge between our coarse grit stone and our fine grit stone. It's going to help us to refine the edge that we've put on with that really coarse grit stone and prep it for polishing. And finally, that finer grit stone is going to do just that, polish the edge of our knife and contribute to that really, really smooth and effortless cutting feel that we're all looking for when we get a brand new or freshly sharpened knife. If you were to only purchase one stone, I would recommend the 1000 grit stone. It's sort of like the workhorse of the progression. It, with a good amount of pressure, will be able to put a new edge on your knife. And if you lighten up on your hand pressure, you'll be able to achieve a good polish with it as well. So again, if you're only looking to pick up one stone, that's the one that I most highly recommend.
So one thing that I notice with my clients is that people are oftentimes getting confused the difference between honing and sharpening. Can you shed some light on that and explain the distinction between those two?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding sharpening a knife is that when you're using your honing rod or your steel, as it's commonly referred to, that long cylindrical hunk of steel that you get with your knife kit, is actually sharpening your knife, when in fact all it is doing is honing your knife. Now the difference between honing and sharpening is, simply put, that sharpening is removing material from our knife and honing is simply realigning the edge on our knife. So as we use our knife, the edge or the cutting edge is going to fold over one side of the blade. Obviously this isn't visible through the naked eye, but on a microscopic level that's what's happening, and that's what's contributing to a dull feeling to your knife. Honing your knife simply realigns that edge that's folded over one side and makes it feel sharp again. Over time though, as we fold our knife over through use and then realign it, it's going to wear away the steel to the point where the edge of our knife becomes rounded, and no amount of honing it is going to bring it back to life. It needs to have steel removed from each side of the blade, making it come to a point again and making it feel sharp, which that edge now we can maintain with our honing rod over time. So I don't want to say that honing is not important. It's very useful if you're in the middle of prepping, say, and you don't have time to get your stones out and sharpen your knife. You just need a tool that's going to quickly revitalize your edge and make your knife feel sharp again until you have time to get back onto the stones and sharpen your knife properly.
So for the average home cook, how often would you recommend that they sharpen their knife?
So, to give you some insight, I used to sharpen my knives every day when I was cooking professionally, but I would more so hone my knives using whetstones than sharpen them. I was using a very high grit stone. I wouldn't say I was removing very much material, and that would allow my knives to stay razor sharp all the time. Mind you, sharpening my knives every day when I was cooking professionally meant I was getting about 8 to 10 hours of physical chopping done with that knife. 8 to 10 hours of use for me is probably in the realm of 2 weeks to a month for the average home user of actual chopping. So ideally you get in the habit of sharpening your knife once a month. I understand that that is still a little bit much for a lot of home users. If you can get in the habit of having your knife sharpened quarterly, 4 times a year, that would be ideal. Hopefully you're sharpening your knives at least once a year, which would be again better than not having them sharpened for years and years at a time. So I would say that the more frequently the better, but again 4 times a year or once a year if that's all you can muster. Let's start right at the very beginning. How are you going to prep your whetstones for sharpening? And the way we're going to do that is simply put them, soak them in water before we use them. Your stone is quite porous. It's not a real stone. It's a thin synthetic stone. It's got lots of pores in it, which are going to allow the stone to soak up a lot of water, which is going to keep the stone hydrated during the sharpening process. So you're going to take your stones, you're going to soak them in water for about 10 to 15 minutes. As soon as you put them in the water, they're going to start to bubble up, which is all of the air leaving those pores of the stone. As soon as that bubbling subsides, you're ready to go. If you pull your stones out of the water and begin sharpening with them and you find that they're drying out immediately, it doesn't matter how much water you're splashing on there, they keep drying out. Just throw them back in the water and let them soak for another 5 minutes or so and then try again. Once you have your stones prepped and ready to go, you want to think about the type of steel you're sharpening with, as we talked about earlier. So try to figure out if it's a stainless steel or if it's a carbon steel, which is going to give you some insight as to what angle you want to sharpen the knife at. Once you've figured that out, we should talk about how you're gonna hold the knife. So typically speaking, when we're using our knife, we're using a pinch grip, which means finding the balance point with our index finger, putting our thumb on the opposite side of the knife, and then wrapping the remainder of our fingers around the handle. This is gonna make it a little bit difficult to sharpen right into the heel of the knife. So we're gonna choke down on our handle a little bit and place our thumb over top of the heel of the knife. Our right hand, if we are in fact right-handed, is going to keep the angle that we choose to sharpen our knife at locked in place. We're not applying any pressure with our right hand. We're simply moving it forward and backwards, guiding the knife across the stone. Our left hand is what's going to apply pressure. So we're going to use our index finger and our middle finger to contact the knife as close to the edge where the knife and the stone meet, without actually running our finger along the stone, as it will remove steel from a knife. So it most certainly will remove skin from your finger, which can lead to cuts, which is obviously not what we're after. So to determine the angle that you sharpen your knife at, there are a lot of tricks out there. There's tons of sharpening videos on YouTube, and everyone seems to have their own preferred method. I'm a firm believer in finding one that's most comfortable for you and one that works for you best. The method that I use to teach my classes with, and one that I find the most effective, is to imagine that if we hold the knife totally perpendicular to the stone, that's going to be 90 degrees. If we cut that in half, we've got 45 degrees, and if we cut that in half again, we've got 22.5. That is, roughly speaking, where you want to be sharpening your stainless steel knives. German-made, sort of mass-produced knives are going to sharpen at that angle. If we know where 22.5 is, we can then just decrease our angle just a little bit more to get to the 15 degrees that we want to sharpen a Japanese knife at. Once you've figured out the angle with which you're going to sharpen your knife at, again, like I said, use your left hand to apply pressure. There should be a good amount of pressure. We're trying to remove steel from our knife, so it's going to require a good amount of force. You should see your fingers sort of changing colors with the amount of pressure you're applying. And again, we're using our left hand to apply pressure and our right hand to guide the knife forward and backwards. What we're trying to do is remove material such that the two sides of the knife come together and meet at a point. You're probably wondering how, so we're gonna sharpen the dominant side of our knife first, or if we're right-handed, while we're holding our knife, the right side of the knife first. It's important not to flip-flop back and forth between the sides. What we're trying to achieve is what's called a burr. So as we sharpen and remove material from our knife, it's going to start to fold over the edge of the knife and create a thin sort of thread of steel. So you want to feel that sort of scratchy burr all the way evenly from the tip of the knife all the way down to the heel. It should feel the same the entire length of the edge. Once we've got that developed, we know we're ready to flip the knife over and do the other side. So when we flip the knife over, we're going to move our thumb from the heel of the knife to the spine. Our index finger is then going to go over top of the heel of the knife where our thumb used to be. Our thumb on our left hand is going to go on the spine of the knife, and then we're going to wrap our index finger and our middle finger over top, again applying pressure as close to the edge of the knife as possible where it meets the stone without actually contacting the stone. Now, instead of starting closest to us on the stone for that back side, we're going to start furthest away and apply pressure as we pull the knife toward ourselves. We should be using the same hand pressure, the same angle, and we're still trying to develop that burr nicely from the tip all the way down to the heel of the knife before we move on to the third and final step on that first stone that we're using, which is to deburr the knife. So that burr we formed is now a loose piece of steel that's kind of flopping back and forth. We need to get rid of that burr and expose our new cutting edge. And the way I like to describe this to people who attend the class is to imagine that we're taking the tab of a pop can and we're folding it over and over and over and over again until eventually it just breaks apart. We're going to try to do the exact same thing with our knife by doing nice long strokes switching sides of the knife each time, which is essentially folding the burr back and forth until it self-releases, or we'll help it out a little bit and just run it along a piece of wood or a wine cork very, very gently without any pressure, just to remove any of that excess steel that still remains on the edge of the knife. Once we finish that process, we're going to do the exact same thing on the medium grit stone. Form a burr on the dominant side, flip over, form a burr on the back side, and then deburr before we move on to the fine grit stone, and then do everything over again. Form that burr on both sides of the knife, deburr, and then we're done. You should have a very, very sharp knife by the end of the process if you've been able to identify and form that burr correctly at each stage.
I hope you enjoyed this video and this demonstration on how to properly sharpen your knife. These are really, really important pieces of caring for your blades. And I can tell you there's nothing more empowering than knowing how to do this on your own so that these nice knives that you purchase can really go the distance when it comes to lasting in terms of sharpness, as well as just overall staying power as a useful tool in your kitchen. Now, that being said, if the visual representation wasn't quite enough and you're like me and you want to have a more hands-on learning approach, and if you're local, Gage offers knife sharpening classes at his store Sharp, downtown Hamilton, every Sunday night. And you can book online. I'll put a link below in the description box. And stay tuned for next week, because we are going to be talking about how to properly care and take care of your knives. Because let's face it, if you're gonna spend a couple $100s on a good blade, you wanna know how to take care of it. So all that next week. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.